The laughter stopped mid-echo. Jimmy Fallon, who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of keeping conversations light and audiences smiling, found himself staring across his desk at a man who was quietly falling apart. The Tonight Show studio, usually buzzing with infectious energy, fell into a silence so profound that even the Roots stopped their casual between-segment riff. Jonathan Bailey sat in the guest chair, impeccably dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that somehow made him look smaller rather than more commanding. His hands, usually expressive when discussing his craft, lay motionless in his lap. The promotional smile he'd worn through the first 10 minutes of their interview had gradually dissolved, leaving behind something raw and unguarded. It had started as a typical celebrity interview. Jonathan was there to promote his latest film, The Serpent's Garden, a psychological thriller where he played a manipulative corporate executive who destroys lives for profit. The role was a dramatic departure from Anthony Bridgerton, the romantic lead that had made him a household name. Critics were calling it his most challenging performance yet, a masterclass in controlled menace. "So, Jonathan," Jimmy had said with his trademark enthusiasm, "this character is pretty intense. How do you get into the headspace of someone like that?" The question was innocent enough, the kind of setup that usually led to charming anecdotes about research and preparation. But something in Jonathan's expression shifted. He looked down at his hands, then back at Jimmy, and for the first time that evening, his media-trained composure cracked. "I lived as him for 3 months," Jonathan said quietly, his British accent carrying a weight that made every word feel significant. Complete method acting. "I became someone I didn't recognize." Jimmy leaned forward slightly, his interviewer instincts picking up on the change in tone. The audience, sensing something different was happening, gradually quieted their casual chatter. "What does that mean exactly?" Jimmy asked, his voice gentler now. Jonathan's laugh was hollow, nothing like the warm chuckle audiences knew from press tours. "It means I stopped being Jonathan Bailey. I woke up as Marcus Rothwell. I thought like him. I felt like him. I manipulated conversations with friends. I found myself calculating how to use people's vulnerabilities against them." The director encouraged it, said it was brilliant work. The studio lights suddenly felt too bright, too exposing. Jimmy could see the exhaustion in Jonathan's eyes, the kind that sleep couldn't fix. "But Jonathan," Jimmy said carefully, "you knew it was for a role, right? You knew you were acting?" That's when Jonathan broke. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical flair one might expect from a trained actor. He simply looked at Jimmy with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young, and whispered, "I lost myself for 3 months, Jimmy. I genuinely lost myself." The words hung in the air, like a confession. The audience was completely silent now, hundreds of people holding their breath as they witnessed something that felt too intimate for television. Jimmy felt his chest tighten. This wasn't the playful banter he'd expected, wasn't the carefully crafted promotional content designed to sell tickets. This was a human being, sitting 3 feet away from him, describing what sounded like a complete psychological breakdown. "I hurt people," Jonathan continued, his voice barely audible. "Real people in my real life. I said things to my friends, my family, that I can't take back. I used information they'd trusted me with against them, just to see if I could. I told myself it was research. But the truth is, I wasn't researching Marcus Rothwell anymore. I was him." Jimmy's hand moved instinctively toward his microphone, but he stopped himself. Every instinct honed from years of live television told him to redirect, to find the light moment, to bring back the energy. Instead, he did something that surprised everyone in the studio, including himself. He turned off his microphone. The small click was barely audible, but it was symbolic. Jimmy Fallon, the perpetual entertainer, was choosing to step out of his role as host and into something more fundamental: human connection. "Jonathan," he said, his voice now intimate, meant only for the man across from him, despite the cameras still rolling. "Look at me. Jonathan raised his eyes, and Jimmy could see the weight of months of carrying this alone. You're here, right now, in this moment. You're Jonathan Bailey. You're sitting across from me, Jimmy Fallon, in New York City, on a Tuesday night. You're not Marcus Rothwell. That person doesn't exist outside of a script. But the damage does, Jonathan replied, his voice cracking. The things I said, the way I treated people, that was real. My sister stopped talking to me for 2 weeks. Because of something I said during filming. I convinced my best friend that his girlfriend was cheating on him, just to see if I could manipulate the situation. I wasn't method acting anymore, Jimmy. I was just being cruel. The cameras continued to roll, but everyone in the studio understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was therapy happening in real time, on live television. Jimmy stood up from behind his desk, something he'd never done during an interview in 15 years of hosting. He walked around to Jonathan's side and, without asking permission, pulled up a chair. He sat directly in front of his guest, abandoning the traditional setup that maintained professional distance. Jonathan, he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from personal experience with darkness. I've been there. Maybe not exactly where you've been, but I've been in that place where you don't recognize yourself anymore. Jonathan looked up, surprised by the sudden shift in dynamics. When I first started in comedy, Jimmy continued, I was so desperate to be funny, to be liked, that I became this caricature of myself. I said yes to everything, laughed at everything, never showed any real emotion because I thought that's what people wanted. I stopped having genuine reactions to anything. My wife had to sit me down and tell me she felt like she was married to a performance, not a person. The confession hung between them, two performers acknowledging the cost of their craft. But here's what I learned, Jimmy said, leaning forward. The person you became for that role, that's not you. That was a character so well constructed that it temporarily overwrote your actual personality. It means you're an incredible actor, but it also means you need to find your way back to yourself. Jonathan's eyes filled with tears. The first genuine emotion he'd shown all evening. I don't know how, he whispered. I don't know how to undo the damage I caused. I don't know how to trust myself again. Jimmy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Without explanation, he scrolled through his contacts and pressed call. The action was so unexpected that even the producers in the control booth weren't sure what was happening. Nancy? Jimmy said into the phone, his voice carrying across the studio's sensitive microphones. It's Jimmy. I'm here with someone who needs to talk to you. Can you stay on the line for a minute? He handed the phone to Jonathan, who looked confused. Nancy is my therapist, Jimmy explained simply. She's helped me remember who I am when I've forgotten. The gesture was so unexpected, so genuine, that Jonathan stared at the phone for a long moment before accepting it. Hello? He said tentatively. What followed was a brief conversation that the audience couldn't hear clearly, but they could see its effect on Jonathan's face. The tension in his shoulders began to ease. His breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, started to deepen. After a few minutes, he handed the phone back to Jimmy. She wants to see you tomorrow, Jimmy said gently. If you want. Jonathan nodded, unable to speak. Jimmy stood up and extended his hand, not for a handshake, but to help Jonathan up from his chair. When Jonathan stood, Jimmy did something that violated every protocol of late-night television. He hugged him, not a brief, camera-friendly embrace, but a real hug, the kind that acknowledges shared humanity. The audience, which had been silent for nearly 20 minutes, began to applaud. Not the enthusiastic, prompted applause of entertainment, but the slow, respectful clapping of people who had witnessed something sacred. When they separated, Jimmy looked directly into the camera. We're going to take a break, he announced. And when we come back, we're going to talk about something lighter. Because sometimes, that's what healing looks like. Moving from heavy to lights, step by step. As the show cut to commercial, Jimmy kept his arm around Jonathan's shoulder, guiding him off stage. The cameras stopped rolling, but the impact of those 20 minutes would resonate far beyond the studio. Later that evening, after the show had ended and the audience had gone home, Jimmy found Jonathan sitting alone in his dressing room, staring at a framed photo of himself with his sister. "She forgave me," Jonathan said without looking up. "I called her after your therapist appointment was set up. She said she'd been waiting for me to come back." Jimmy sat down beside him. "The people who love us, they usually do wait. I was so afraid," Jonathan continued, "that I'd lost myself permanently, that the person I became for that role was who I really was underneath everything." "But you didn't," Jimmy replied. "You came back. You're here." Jonathan finally looked at him, and for the first time that evening, his smile was genuine. "Thank you for stopping the show," he said. "Thank you for choosing to be human instead of just being a host." Jimmy shrugged, his own smile reflecting the weight of what they'd shared. Sometimes the best television happens when you stop trying to make television. The episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to remove the difficult moments. The response was unlike anything The Tonight Show had ever experienced. Mental health organizations praised Jimmy's handling of the situation. Actors came forward to share their own struggles with method acting and losing themselves in roles. Jonathan Bailey's performance in The Serpent's Garden went on to earn him an Oscar nomination, but he would later say that the most important acting he'd ever done was learning to play himself again, with the help of a late-night host who chose compassion over comedy when it mattered most. The interview became a turning point, not just for Jonathan, but for conversations about mental health in entertainment. And Jimmy Fallon learned something that would change how he approached every interview afterward. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply witness someone's pain and respond with love. 3 months later, Jonathan returned to The Tonight Show for a follow-up appearance. This time, he walked onto the stage with a lightness that hadn't been there before. His smile was genuine, his eyes clear, and when Jimmy introduced him, the audience's applause carried a different energy, not just excitement, but genuine affection for someone they'd watched struggle and heal. "So," Jimmy said, with a grin that reached his eyes, "how are you doing? Really doing?" Jonathan laughed, and the sound was warm and unguarded. "I'm doing the work," he said simply. "Therapy twice a week, meditation every morning, and I've learned to separate Jonathan Bailey from whatever character I'm playing. It sounds simple, but it's the hardest thing I've ever had to learn." "Tell me about that," Jimmy encouraged. "Well," Jonathan began, settling into his chair with a comfort that hadn't existed during their first interview. "I learned that method acting, when taken to extremes, can be a form of dissociation. You literally disconnect from your own identity. My therapist, Nancy, whom you introduced me to, helped me understand that I was using the character as a way to avoid dealing with my own emotional issues." The audience listened intently, invested now in Jonathan's journey in a way that transcended typical celebrity interest. "The character of Marcus Rothwell was everything I was afraid of becoming," Jonathan continued. "Manipulative, cold, calculating. And somewhere in my subconscious, I think I believed that if I could embody that perfectly, I could control those aspects of myself. But what actually happened was that I gave those dark impulses permission to exist without any moral filter." Jimmy nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "It's like you were trying to face your shadow self, but instead of observing it, you became it." "Exactly," Jonathan said, his voice growing stronger. "And the scariest part was how easy it became. How natural it felt to manipulate situations, to see people as chess pieces rather than human beings. It was terrifying to realize I was capable of that level of coldness. But you came back from it," Jimmy pointed out. "That matters. I came back because people like you reminded me who I actually was." Jonathan replied, his voice thick with gratitude. "When you stopped being a host and became a human being in that moment, you reflected back to me the person I had lost. You saw Jonathan Bailey when I couldn't see him myself." The studio fell quiet again, But this time it was the comfortable silence of people sharing a meaningful moment, rather than the tense quiet of crisis. I've actually started a foundation, Jonathan continued, straightening in his chair. It's called the Method Project, and it provides mental health resources, specifically for actors who struggle with character immersion. Turns out, I wasn't alone in this experience. Jimmy's face lit up with genuine pride. That's incredible. How many people have you helped so far? We've worked with about 50 actors in the first 3 months, Jonathan said. Some very famous names that I can't mention, but also a lot of unknown performers who were suffering in silence. Method acting is taught in drama schools without adequate discussion of the psychological risks. We're trying to change that. What would you say to someone watching right now who's struggling with losing themselves, whether in a role or just in life? Jimmy asked. Jonathan looked directly into the camera, his gaze steady and compassionate. I would say that the person you're afraid you've become isn't the real you. The real you is the one who's worried about who you've become. That concern, that desire to return to yourself, that's your authentic self calling you home. Trust that voice, seek help, and remember that healing isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole again. The audience erupted in applause, but it was different from typical TV applause. It was the sound of people recognizing truth, of hearts connecting across the invisible barrier between stage and seats. As the segment ended and they prepared for the next portion of the show, Jimmy reached across his desk and shook Jonathan's hand. Thank you, Jimmy said simply, for coming back, for doing the work, for showing us what recovery looks like. Thank you for saving my life, Jonathan replied, his words carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. The camera caught the moment. 2 men, both performers, both human, acknowledging the profound impact of choosing compassion over entertainment. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important conversations happen not in therapy offices or support groups, but in unexpected moments when someone chooses to be present for another person's pain. That night, the Method Project began trending on social media. Mental health organizations reported a spike in calls from entertainment industry professionals seeking help, and Jimmy Fallon's approach to interviewing shifted permanently, incorporating a deeper understanding that behind every performer is a human being deserving of genuine care and attention. The story of Jonathan Bailey's breakdown and recovery became more than entertainment. It became a blueprint for how public figures could address mental health openly and honestly. Most importantly, it demonstrated that healing is possible, that identity can be reclaimed, and that sometimes the best thing one human being can do for another is simply to witness their struggle and respond with love. Because that's what healing looks like. Not perfect, not polished, just human.